get started. Now, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the roundtable discussion today at SPOUT 25, entitled Remembering the Second Indochina War, Marginal and Emerging Voices. My name is Dat Nguyen. I'm a researcher at the NIOT Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies, where I'm also conducting research on war legacy issues in Vietnam. And today I have the pleasure to moderate this roundtable discussion. As many of you may have already known, this year marks the 50th commemoration of the end of the Second Indochina War, more popularly known in the Western context as the Vietnam War. And over the course of last month, as well as a couple of months before that, there have been many events, roundtable discussion, workshops, as well as publications where scholars, journalists, writers, artists, and people whose life and whose family lives were touched by the war, they discuss, remember, and reflect on the war and its many impacts. Needless to say, the history of the war is complex, and there are so many voices, perspectives, experiences, and histories that no single event or publication can fully capture. So it is our hope today that this roundtable can bring up and help us consider perspective and experiences that we may have missed elsewhere. And so it's my pleasure today to be joined by 5 distinguished speakers who will shed some light on the complex histories of the war and their aftermaths. And each of the speakers will have 10 to 12 minutes or so to reflect on the war from their own research, professional experiences, but also at times more personal, familiar experiences. I will keep time, and I will give you the 3 minutes and then 1 minute signal. And then after all the reflections, we will open the floor for Q&A with the audience. Okay? So our first speaker today will be Kevin Pham. Kevin is an assistant professor of political theory at the University of Amsterdam. He is the author of The Architects of Dignity, Vietnamese Visions of Decolonization, for which he did have a book launch here last year. And Kevin's parents were refugees from Vietnam, and he was born and raised in San Jose, California. And Kevin will first guide us through how the Second Indochina War emerged out of the history of decolonization in Vietnam. So, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I see so many familiar faces. Thank you for coming. So let me begin with some very brief history. It dawned on me that I had never seen a timeline of Vietnamese history, so I spent all morning making one. So those are years at the bottom, and so we often hear that there was Chinese colonialism, and I put that in quotation marks, because can you really call it colonialism? Occupation, domination, Chinese rule for 1,000 years. And then after that, there's Vietnamese colonialism, of course punctuated with periods of peace and wars with Champa, the Cham kingdom. And that's important to say because this is largely what the Third Indochina War was over. A few months ago, I was in Vietnam, and then I went to Cambodia, and I was walking in the streets in Phnom Penh, and I had a bag with the map of Vietnam, the S-shaped map, and a Cambodian man on the street went up to me and he said, "You think that's Vietnam? Only the top part is Vietnam." And I, as a Kin ethnic member, felt like a colonizer for the first time. So, and then you have the French colonialism and 3 Indochina Wars squeezed into this very later period. Let's zoom in over there. French colonialism, almost 100 years, 1858, 1954. First Indochina War was a war fought between, on the one hand, it was between Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, which is a coalition of communist and non-communist Vietnamese who wanted to kick out the French versus the French. But at the same time, it quickly devolved into a civil war between Vietnamese people, communists and non-communists in the South Vietnam. And then the Second Indochina War is called the Vietnam War by Americans, but for the communists, they call it officially the Resistance War against America to save the country. And for some anti-communists, they call it the War against Northern Communist Invasion. And then the Third Indochina War was a series of wars between the new Vietnamese government and Cambodia and China. So I just wanted to quickly acknowledge this history. One way, and there are many ways of understanding the Second Indochina War, is that it was a war between Vietnamese people with different political visions for Vietnam after French colonialism. They had different answers to questions such as, once we have independence, who should rule? What values should guide Vietnamese society? What economic system should we have? What is a good government? They had conflicting beliefs about the right answers, and these conflicts devolved into violent conflict. So these ideological conflicts start really during the French colonial period, because when French colonialism was happening, they had to respond to it. So if we want to understand the Vietnam War, the Second Indochina War, we need to understand how Vietnamese thinkers were debating these questions in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And that has been, I think, a missing perspective in studying this war, which is how Vietnamese thinkers respond to French colonialism. So that's why I wrote this book. And you could buy it over there, the American Book Center. And in this book, I show how 6 influential Vietnamese thinkers, intellectuals, activists, politicians debated important questions, such as, why were we conquered by France? It was not straightforward. Social Darwinism was the prevailing ideology at the time, and the explanation is we were conquered because we were weak, France is strong, so let's see what the strong are doing. It's a law of nature, and we would colonize if we could. Later, that's going to be displaced as an explanation. A new explanation will come, Leninism, which explains colonialism as an outgrowth of capitalism. Also, how should we respond to colonialism? The first thing many did in the early 1900s was go to Japan. Japan had defeated the Russians. This was very impressive to not only Asians, but also any non-white people, because they saw the Russians as white, and oh wow, Asians can defeat white people for the first time. So hundreds of Vietnamese went to schools in Japan, and they brought back ideas of modernity, of how to learn from the West. They brought back ideas of science, democracy. What should we do with our traditions? As you know, Chinese rule had meant that Confucianism had infused Vietnamese society everywhere. So Vietnamese thinkers were very creative. They mixed ideas. It's called Indochina because it's in between the cultural spheres of India and China. They could not identify an indigenous intellectual tradition, so they proudly fused them, Confucianism with liberalism, Confucianism with Marxism, Confucianism with Catholicism. This is what Phan Chu Trinh, Ho Chi Minh, and Ngo Dinh Diem were doing. They debated, what should revolution mean? Oh, I think it's cut off a bit, but that's okay. So the answers that Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, gave to these questions differ from the answers that Ngo Dinh Diem, the leader of South Vietnam, gave. Ho Chi Minh is inspired by Lenin and Stalin. He wants a communist revolution. Ngo Dinh Diem is inspired by the ideology, what he calls personalism. But even calling this war a war between communists and anti-communists might not be so accurate, some are beginning to argue. If we actually look at the ideas, the speeches of Ngo Dinh Diem, we see that he's often anti-capitalist. And his personalist ideology was a mix of Catholicism and Marxist humanism. Some scholars, like Duy Lat Nguyen, argue that, therefore, the war was actually between 2 kinds of communists, Stalinists and Marxist humanists. That's mind-blowing to me. I never thought that, you know. So there's new research on the Republic of Vietnam these days, so that's very exciting. So in the past 10 years, there has been more attention to Vietnamese perspectives. And one thing that I want to get across today is that Ho Chi Minh's vision might have prevailed, but it was one vision out of many alternatives that were also possibilities at the time. So the there's also more interest in the Republic of Vietnam, as I said. So the orthodox narrative is that the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, were puppets of the United States. They did not have ideas of their own, but new research is showing how its thought leaders, Ngo Dinh Nhu, Ngo Dinh Diem, were thinkers as well. So I think this is interesting to me personally, and I want to be more personal now, is that I grew up in San Jose, California with a very anti-communist family, and to be really honest with you, it was often difficult for me to sympathize with them. I grew up as a punk rock leftist with Marxist friends, and I remember one time, one of my Marxist friends in college, a white man, he told me, "Your family left Vietnam because they were lazy and didn't want to work." My dad and mom almost died on boats trying to get to the country, and I wanted to say to him, no, they were being persecuted. If they stayed, they could have been killed. They would have their opportunities, educational, professional, barred from them. They would be living as second-class citizens. It's not that they were lazy and they didn't want to work. I went to my aunt, who was in her 70s, and I asked her, what was life like before the war, and why did you leave Vietnam? And she said, life was great. We had a big house. We had a garden. I read books in the backyard all day. We had servants. They took it all away, and they made us work. That's supposed to be funny, because it's funny. I mean, it's so in a sense, there's some truth, maybe, but no. I could sympathize with my family, and I personally don't want to live under a Stalinist dictatorship, and so. It was easy to understand what the DRV, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, was fighting for in the North, communist revolution, and therefore, and by the way, let's be clear, that was their aim. There used to be this debate, was Ho Chi Minh really a nationalist or a communist? That debate is resolved. He was firmly a communist revolutionary. It makes no sense to me when I hear people say he only wanted national independence, because yes, he wanted that, but afterwards, what, you think he was agnostic about what kind of society he wanted Vietnam to be? No, he was very clear. He wanted a communist revolution. This is good news if you are a communist, but it's also weird because this aligns with American war hawks who wanted to go to Vietnam to stop communism. But you can see Tuong Vu's recent book, Vietnam's Communist Revolution, where he really settles this debate. So I will wind up shortly, 2 minutes left. So my dad left on a boat on April 30, 1975, the day the war ended, when the communists took over. And he got on a boat with 4,000 people, and the captain of that boat was my granduncle, his uncle. And so I found in my aunt's home one day in the drawers a folder full of newspaper clippings from all over the world with my granduncle's face on it. And he was going around the country giving speeches to thousands of Vietnamese about needing to go back and liberate Vietnam from, get it back, you know, and continue fighting. And so all my life I have spent myself navigating these different tensions between my Marxist friends and my anti-communist family. I decided to go back to live in Vietnam for 8 months after I graduated from university, just to learn, relearn the language, relearn about the country. And so it's been a journey. It's been an amazing journey. And I guess the one message I want to get across to all of you is that there's so much to learn. There's so much complexity to these series of wars, so many lessons, and so many ongoing debates. And so I'm thankful to be here and to start this conversation. Thank you.
Right before. Kevin, can you, I think you still have a couple of slides, right, from your, yeah.
My parents. And my dad got a tattoo of the boat, silhouette of the boat that he left Vietnam on, and my brother did the tattoo. He's a tattoo artist in California. And that's me in Vietnam, and yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I think your reflections brought up a lot of interesting things, you know, also with the sort of historiography of the Vietnam War, how there's just so many different sort of attention now to the Vietnamese perspective, and sort of all these sort of the tension between the different visions of what post-colonial Vietnam supposed to look like, but also some sort of new understanding of the political theories behind some of these figures that we have traditionally characterized in black and white terms, and they're not always so. So while the Vietnam War was sort of often viewed predominantly again through the lenses of the struggle between the U.S. and Vietnam, but also within Vietnam itself, it was at its core sort of a true international war with many countries and parties involved. And so I'm going to try to move on to our next two speakers, who will tell us a little bit about the perspective of parties and groups that are often not highlighted at all in the Vietnam War historiography. So we will start first with Stephanie Bensakin-Coltier. So Stephanie is a visual historian who has written extensively on violence, archive, memory, and activism in Cambodia. And among her many works is the recently published volume, Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, a multifaceted history of the Khmer Rouge crimes. And she's now working on the monograph about the Khmer Republic, which I think is very interesting and has a lot of comparative angles with the Republic of Vietnam. And so today she will help us understand a little bit more about sort of the experiences of refugees at the Cambodia-Vietnam border during the war.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here, and hello everyone. So I think I will echo Kevin in many ways, because, but from a Cambodian perspective. So yeah, so when Dad proposed to have this roundtable, he sent a question which was about the importance of the Second Indochina War, intellectually and personally, and I think, that took me some time to come with some answer, and actually I thought it was about the present and the fact that we need to know more about the Second Indochina War if we want to understand the political landscape in the area, if we want to understand the regional interactions. Because what we see right now, and I think it's a bit ironic, because we speak about the global Vietnam War and the effect of the Vietnam War in all kinds of countries, but when it comes to the interaction between Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, then it's a different story. And then I think it's also very important for understanding the formation of political culture. And to give you an example, I did a workshop last summer in Cambodia with students who are in their early 20s. And we watched a lot of archives together. And at some point, we came across the footage of the proclamation of the Khmer Republic in October 70. And it was, for many students, the first time they saw this footage. And when I showed them some people on the image, I said, but you know who this is? And they were like, okay, well, this one we know, it's Lon Nol, the marshal, who was also part of one of the main initiators of the coup that deposed Sihanouk. But then I showed them other people, and important people like Sirik Matak, who was also very instrumental in the deposition of Sihanouk, and they didn't know who he was. And that, for me, shows pretty much how historical knowledge in Cambodia is totally fragmented. And it's not surprising, because they have, young Cambodians have been used to learn history in terms of, there was, the colonial period. Then there was the Sangkum, which is the post-independence period, which is dominated by Norodom Sihanouk. Then there is something like, we don't know what it is. Technically, it's the Khmer Republic, something we can also discuss in terms of periodization and denomination. Then you have, of course, the Khmer Rouge. Then you have, and here it becomes complicated. Should we say the Vietnamese intervention? Should we say the Vietnamese occupation? Well, we need to keep maybe a bit neutral here. Let's say intervention. Then 89, the Vietnamese go away. Then we have this kind of weird period. And then finally comes the UNTAC, the UN mission in Cambodia. And then we are on tracks for Cambodia as it is right now. A monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, with something that was supposed to be, multiple party, but it's a kind of authoritarian regime. There is also a very interesting term, progenitocracy, I think, which is the idea that you have a prime minister who is in power for almost 40 years and just gives the keys to the ministership to his own son. So, and you have this kind of transmission from ministers to their own sons reproduced in many posts in Cambodia. So you have something here that is extremely problematic, and I think that we do not understand how political culture is formed in Cambodia if we do not see something which is more a continuity. So that's, in a way, why I think the Second Indochina War is so important to understand. So that's one point. And then there are many blind spots. And my research, as I said, is about the Khmer Republic. So to make a long story short, there is the deposition of Norodom Sihanouk in March 70. The Republic is declared in October 70. There is immediately war. And that is another form of discussion, another kind of discussion we could have. I mean, to what extent the Republic can be decoupled from the war. To what extent, you know, you have a civil war or a proxy war, because for many years the Khmer Republic will say that the enemy is the external enemy. It's the Vietnamese communist aggressor, but certainly not, you know, an indigenous insurgency. But at some point they are forced to acknowledge that, yes, this insurgency, the Khmer Rouge, is a Cambodian one. So that's a very complicated topic, in fact. It looks very easy like that, but I think there are many different opinions and nuances to bring into the discussion. So, and then the Republic collapses on the 17th of April 75, with, of course, the fall of Phnom Penh to the Khmer Rouge. And it has not been studied much. In fact, the last studies that have been done on the Khmer Republic date back to the early 90s. And mostly it's diplomatic history, military history, political science. That's it. And mostly it's based on US records, government records, and also military records. That's it. It does not mean that it's not interesting, and the focus on US-Cambodian relationships is also very interesting, but it's a bit limited. And I was very surprised to see that nothing had been done since almost 30 years, and that these views that the Khmer Republic, like its counterpart in Vietnam, the Republic of South Vietnam, to make it clear, it's the same cliché. It's also an American puppet. It does not have any genuine political project. It's a kind of empty shell. And I was really wondering, you know, where does it come from? So my research started with this question, you know, how do we deconstruct all these discourses about the Khmer Republic, and how do we try to reconstruct something different? And I have to say that the whole scholarship about South Vietnam, which has developed in the past 20 years, has been extremely useful to reframe my questions, but also to see the limitations of applying that kind of scholarship to another republic, because there are a lot of differences. I mean, already in terms of duration, in terms of power. So it was a bit complicated to construct simply bridges like that. So it's also something that I like to discuss, how we can combine this kind of scholarships, and at the same time, how what we do about Cambodia and the Khmer Republic can also shed a new light on what was happening in Vietnam. And I'm talking about economic and military collaboration. I'm talking about exchanges, you know, in border zones, about refugees. I will come to that point in a minute. So about also diasporic imaginaries of the war, about the effect of bombardments, because Cambodia was also heavily bombed by the US Air Force. So there are many things that could be studied productively and comparatively. So yeah, and my perspective on the Khmer Republic is something about mobility. So I consider that the Khmer Republic is the very first, not the very first, because you have colonial mobilities already. So the society, the Cambodian society is set into motion already from the colonial period and then in the post-independence. But still, with the Khmer Republic, you have maybe the first big movements of population. And I'm talking about 2 million refugees at least within for 5 years. It's enormous. You have to understand that the population in Cambodia at the time is hardly 7 million. And we don't know exactly because it's very difficult to come up with real numbers and statistics, but you have even numbers that say, accumulative numbers that say that half the population at some point has been displaced during these 5 years. And we are speaking about experiences that come before the Khmer Rouge period. So you can imagine the level of exhaustion and I don't know, and terrible experiences that people have even before the Khmer Rouge arrived to power. And that is something that has not been really acknowledged, I think, so far. So that's also something that really caught me. And it's mobilization, it's mobility in all kinds of ways. It's the mobilization of society because you have an army that is 30,000 people when the war starts in March 70, and which is within a few months 300,000. So you have to imagine what it means for a society to go to that extent of militarization. Then you have social movements, so you have all kinds of things. So this brought me also to conceive the history of the Khmer Republic, not from the point of view of the military, the diplomatic, the political science, etc., but from the point of view of social and cultural history. Which brings me 2 minutes, I have to be very quick, to the question of the archive, but we can develop it a bit later, and the paucity of archives from the Khmer Republic and the need to expand our conceptions of the archive, to expand in terms of materiality. So that's why I'm working a lot with visual archives, sonic archives, material, architectural, even environmental archives, but also to expand it geographically, which means to stop working only with records from the US, but also to start looking maybe, and that's a very difficult thing, it's just a project, not yet something I'm able to do, but to look into the archives of, I don't know, of countries like Indonesia, who were also involved, Japan, Malaysia, so all kinds of Asian countries which have not been explored in relation to the Khmer Republic. And I try to finish as quick as possible. I wanted to speak more about ethnic Vietnamese refugees, but I think we will come up to that. And it's important that we have collaborations, because so far I think there is a kind of divide. So it's very important, and I think this roundtable is a very important first step into creating more collaborative platforms and exchange of informations, and maybe trying to work about completing new forms of archives, and yeah. So.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of interest, a lot of complicated and also a very interesting point, which is, I mean, I think one of the fascinating aspects of looking at the history of the Second Indochina War and the Vietnam War now is also to expand it to see what sort of inter-Asian and inter-Southeast Asia connection, because I think that's also been a part that is very much missing. Because what's going on, in Vietnam had sort of tremendous repercussions in Cambodia, in Laos, and it requires sort of a different kind of historiography in order to address all of these connections. Mention of international involvement and connections, so we're going to move now a little bit closer to home. We will look at the Dutch experience during the war. And let me introduce our speaker, Rimco van der Mar. Mm-hmm. So Rimco is an assistant professor in history of international relations at the University of Amsterdam, and he specializes in the history of Dutch diplomacy and foreign relations, particularly during the Cold War and in the Third World Solidarity movement from the 50s to the 70s. And he just published a book in The Bond from Vietnam, which came out just last month. Which discusses North and South Vietnamese propaganda strategy during the Vietnam War and its impact in the West. And now I think you will talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah. All right. I will put this over here. Thank you. I've written down 6 pages, so I'm not so comfortable speaking freely as you are. So I've written down everything. I hope to be in. It will be in 12 minutes. We'll see. First of all, thank you for inviting me, of course. It's really an honor to speak for you here in Amsterdam, at this place 60 years ago, 65, there were protests over here at this square. So it's a good place to start a discussion. You mentioned in the introduction, as you mentioned, I've published a book in the Bond van Vietnam. I don't know exactly how to translate it. Under the spell of Vietnam, we talked about it. It's about the information and propaganda war during the Vietnam War, and it's described from the north, both North and South Vietnamese perspectives. It's intended, and it's important for a wider Dutch audience, so it's in Dutch. But it is based on extensive academic research, and I could not have written this book without using the many studies on different Vietnamese groups and participants that have become available in the last 20 years. I would first like to tell you shortly about the angle I have chosen, and then I will describe the development of the Dutch anti-Vietnam War movement. And I would like to end, if there's time, with a few comments on the reception of my book and the responses I received from different sides, including former members of the anti-Vietnam War movement. As you all know, most of you do know, and I explain in the book, in the introduction, research on the Second Indochina War has, for a long time, has been dominated by American and Western historians. And these historians have also depicted the anti-Vietnam movement mainly as an exclusively Western phenomenon with Western factors involved, such as the spread of television, the discovery of the Third World, the post-war baby boom, or transnational youth culture, to name a few. And to be honest, in my dissertation about the Netherlands in the Vietnam War, which appeared in 2007, I used the same Western lens, one-sided Western lens, I have to say. In my latest book, however, I argue that in relation to Western countries, both North and South Vietnamese were not the passive dependent parties, neither were they the victim of grateful or grateful recipients of Western aid. On the contrary, they played a much more active and influential role by disseminating information, propaganda, and visual material, of course. Or as the Vietnamese communists did, by contacting potential Western sympathizers through Eastern European embassies and encourage them to protest. And also by misleading them. For example, by giving visiting Western sympathizers and journalists well-directed and one-sided tours in Vietnam, around Hanoi mostly, convincing them of the unity of the country and the righteousness of North Vietnamese system and its struggle. At the same time, the Vietnamese communists propagandized an image of South Vietnam as a problematic, divided, illegitimate, difficult word, nation with no future prospects. By using a deceiving liberation narrative, they insisted that the South Vietnamese people spontaneously and massively rebelled against a neo-colonial repressive puppet regime. In the meantime, with American help, the South Vietnamese government spread its anti-communist message. In addition, a very interesting South Vietnamese so-called Third Way was active throughout the war. This movement, which consisted of students, members of parliaments, journalists, lawyers, priests, and Buddhists, tried to find and indeed found support in the West, including the Netherlands, for a neutral democratic South Vietnamese coalition government and peace. And at first, the Vietnamese communists were only successful within small Western circles, activist and intellectual circles. However, as the war escalated, the US Air Force bombed South and North Vietnam on a daily basis, and the humanitarian crisis in South Vietnam became a hotly debated topic in the Western media. They gradually managed to reach moderate and also influential political circles who grew tired of the war and began to feel sympathy for the North Vietnamese struggle. Okay, I will skip one part and we'll go to the Dutch anti-Vietnam War movement. How does the Dutch anti-Vietnam War movement fit in this development? Like in other Western countries, the Dutch anti-Vietnam War movement started in small left-wing students and intellectual circles and progressive pacifist church groups. In order to get in touch with the Dutch, North Vietnam and the Liberation Front used their embassies in Prague and other Eastern European countries, and communist platforms, very important, such as the World Federation of Democratic Youth. For example, in 1965, representatives of the Liberation Front approached Dutch communist youth during a conference in Sofia. During the conversation that followed, the ulterior motives of the Vietnamese envoys became clear. They instructed the Dutch youth, I quote, to avoid extremist elements in the organizations of protests because they could stand in the way of gaining support of a larger section of society, unquote. As the war escalated, the movement indeed grew larger, and so were the demonstrations. Most of the new Dutch participants, however, were reluctant to associate themselves with North Vietnam or the Viet Cong. Although these people were angered by the ongoing American bombings and increasingly worried about the fate of the Vietnamese people, especially children, they avoided harsh criticism of the US. Already since the 1920s, the Netherlands was an explicit anti-communist country. And after World War II, criticizing the American liberator of Western Europe was long considered unthankful or just plain rude. So in order to reach a wider audience, the organizers thought it would be wise to keep the slogans moderate and inoffensive. Cries of Johnson, murderer, which was allowed in the Netherlands for being offensive and illegal, and therefore illegal to a friendly head of state, became taboo. Instead, the slogans during larger demonstrations in '67 were restrained, such as peace in Vietnam, or a little more daring, stop the bombardments, urging the US to take the first step to peace. A National Vietnam Committee founded in '67 also used the strategy of connecting directly to protests in the United States, along the rationale that the Dutch would be less reticent if they only realized that a large section of American society, the other America, agreed with them. In this stage, the representatives from North Vietnam and the South Vietnamese Liberation Movement were not able to establish close relations with the Dutch Vietnam movement. This can also be explained by the isolated position of the Dutch Communist Party. Unlike in Belgium, where Belgian communists, at the request of North Vietnamese envoys, played a leading role in setting up larger Vietnam demonstrations, in the Netherlands, activists suspected the Dutch Communist Party of misusing the Vietnam War for political gain and shut them out. Nevertheless, the North Vietnamese and their South Vietnamese allies managed to reach some of the leading activists. As a consequence, the National Committee began seeking donations for medical aid for victims of the war, which was to say those in North Vietnam or in areas under Liberation Front control. When the peace negotiations, how many minutes do I have? 3 minutes. 3? Yeah. Ooh. When the peace negotiations between the US and North Vietnam in Paris stalled in '69, the Dutch Vietnam movement would increasingly focus on providing medical aid to North Vietnam and southern allies. The Netherlands Vietnam Medical Committee, founded by doctors, played an important role in this development. Although US forces were being phased out, the South Vietnamese army in the spirit was being built up in a massive scale, while the American bombing campaign was intensified with the aim of forcing an agreement. As a result, this is very important, more and more Dutchmen came to perceive and sympathize with the North Vietnam as a third world underdog that was being victimized by a Western superpower. At the same time, the South Vietnamese government, which already had a bad reputation in the early '60s, was criticized for being corrupt, undemocratic, repressive, and the main obstacle for peace. Public sympathy was bolstered by visits from the Paris delegation of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. It's the political successor of the Liberation Front. And the provisional government presents itself as independent, but in reality it was strongly tied to the North Vietnamese government. And while in North Vietnam, undemocratic and political opposition obviously was entirely impossible, Dutch activists increasingly portrayed a favorable image of this country and its southern allies. The collected money went to medicines, medical instruments, and other supplies like scientific literature. I have a section on 73 until 75, but due to time issues, I will go to the final section, to the responses. Yeah. Yes? Yeah. Okay. So if you would like more and you read Dutch, you can read my book. This my book asked the Dutch reader to look at the Vietnam War from a different and to many unusual perspective. I would like to end it with a few striking responses. First, I got a couple of emails from critics of the Dutch anti-war movement who thanked me for writing this book. One of them wrote to me, as a student, it struck me that the reporting was highly one-sided. Nothing about abuses in North Vietnam. The Vietnamese did not actually exist as full human beings, at most as victims. It was always just about the perspectives of the critical Western reporters and activists. And another emailed me that 20 years ago he had complained in a national newspaper about the one-sided information on which Dutch history teachers of graduation classes based their Vietnam War lessons. He wrote to me, all adults with, you may assume, some knowledge of history obediently swallowed the catechism from Hanoi. Members of the anti-Vietnam War movement also responded to my book. I hope to receive more of this, people from the movement, but it's already notable that the responses are diverse, from flat-out denying that their members actually were misguided, to welcoming my book and admitting that they did not really know the war and its history very well. One of them said to me that in those days he did not feel the urge to question North Vietnam's standpoint at all. Driven by the misery of the West and the US in particular caused in the global South, he believed the war to be anti-imperialist struggle and a people's war and just cause. It was only after reading my book that this former activist started to think about the relevance of the long-term Vietnamese history and the role of propaganda before and during the war. And someone else wrote to me, it was wonderful to be shaken up again. And finally, I received a few responses from former Vietnamese boat refugees who started a new life here in the Netherlands. These messages touched me because I honestly wasn't really thinking about this group while writing this book. One of them wrote to me, as a former refugee, I am grateful that you highlight the war from the perspective of disinformation, manipulation, and propaganda. The lesson that we should always remain critical is more relevant than ever. Okay, I have some ideas about the future research. I feel a little bit alone in the Netherlands, I have to say. I'm one of the few who studies this topic. There are a few others, but not much, but we'll see. We see later during the roundtable discussion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Remco. I hope that after this, I think you won't be alone for much longer. I'm sure that there will be students and future researchers who are going to try to take up some of the questions that you have raised. And I think your reflections also touch upon something that I think is very important to look at, the issues of propaganda and the kind of narratives that are being circulated around. And I think to tie back to Kevin's and also Stephanie's presentation, I mean, sort of the questions of how we have to be sort of critical about these portrayals of certain characters, certain institutions, certain forces, right? And the sort of the more international look that we have, about the war and all these different connections can paint a very different pictures compared to if we just limit it to a sort of a national account or nascent, or sort of this account between U.S. and Vietnam as the only parties involved in the war. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to move on now, and then we can come back to talk a little bit further in the discussion. We have heard thus far about sort of the historical experiences during the time of war. And of course, after the war ended, societies and community needed to heal from and address the many legacy of the war. So now we will hear from two speakers about quite an emotionally intense war legacy, namely the recovery, identification, and commemoration of the fallen soldiers, particularly the missing in action. So at the NIOTS, my dear colleague Tom Ngo here has been leading a research project called Bones of Contention, Technologies of Identification and the Politics of Reconciliation in Vietnam that examines the use of sort of new DNA technology to identify MIA soldiers and also the social cultural politics surrounding that practice. And for this project, an important scientific and societal partner has been the International Commission for Missing Persons, where Andreas Kleiser has been the Director of Policy and Cooperation since 2006. So I would like to give the floor first to Tam, who can tell us a bit more about these sort of post-war recovery efforts in Vietnam, and then later Andreas, who will tell us more about the scientific development central to this effort.
Thank you, Dad. Good evening, everyone. Am I having 6 minutes or 12 minutes? Okay. Well, I have written also somewhat 12 pages or so, but I decided to drop it because I love to speak, and if I am given a paper, I will speak even longer than that. We were asked to reflect, to come to this event to remember the Vietnam War. But through our work, it is very, very clear to us that it's not only remembering, but there's a lot of work of healing and rebuilding is to be done. That is immense amount of work, and so that helped to guide our thoughts by two questions. One is how the war is connected to us personally. So I will start with there by a disclosure that the war was not the first thing that I would think of studying. I come to the Netherlands in 2001, and Vietnam then was still known, I shared your feeling, Vietnam is still known as either the Lumpia car at the square here, or as a war. And as someone who come in to this country, I want to learn something new. I want to move away from that stereotype of my country and my people. I want some terrain uncharted. And so I study, because I also want to visit my mother. I come from northern part of Vietnam, where the time that I was born, the Vietnam Wars were far away in terms of space and time. But there was another war, the war between Vietnam and China, that is part of the Third Indochina, the war that Kevin has just briefly mentioned earlier. So I started out studying actually the culture change and religious transformation in a group of people called the Hmong. Well, you see I have this lovely dress. I want to highlight how wonderful the textile culture of that people is, and that's what also they are known throughout the world. But my question that I did my PhD on was about how out of sudden, a third of a million Hmong in Vietnam became Christian. So then I embarked on a study that was fascinating. I published a book with Washington University Press. You can get them quite cheap on Kindle nowadays. That book is a story about how a mountain group of people who live in the border between Vietnam, China, Vietnam, and Laos listened by accident to a radio broadcasting out of Manila, sponsored by American evangelists. Overnight turned into Christian believer. And of course, my book investigates the 20 years of their transformation. It brought me to Minnesota, to Madison, to Wisconsin, where I learned about how in that religious transformation, the last picture that looms in the background is the legacy of Vietnam War. So I want to move away from the war. I want to not to address it. I was brought into it. And another accounts that constantly come up in my interview with my Hmong people when I want to study about their religious transformation is they mention their own story, their family story that were caught up in the Vietnam War, the account of death that they saw. So eventually, in 2011, my research has taken a deadly turn. I can no longer avoid the question of war and what it produced, namely the massive amount of bodies that fell and that went missing, and the long suffering of a society, in this case 3 society, that has been coping with in the question of where is my son, where is my husband. So since 2011, I started working with Vietnamese veterans, with Vietnamese family, and also with various state institutions who are tasked with the job of fighting down, locating and identifying the name of the, the number is not certain, there is no exact number, but roughly 500,000 Vietnamese soldiers who is either missing in name or missing in body. And in that work, I have followed a principle of trying to understand how this task is a task that have to be done in the collaboration between the state and the society. In a society that, like Vietnam, the foundation of nationalism is based on the idea that we put freedoms, national independence above everything, and men and women are called to sacrifice, to make the ultimate sacrifice, namely to die in war. But that is no longer a sacrifice that people do not ask for return, namely the obligation of the state. So in the last 20 years, it is 10 burning issues for Vietnamese state and society that characterize Vietnamese society. I have to emphasize, every single one person in Vietnam you talk to, I guarantee you they will come up with the name of one or two or many people in their family. They are still want to know where their body is because they went to war and never come back. So in my research, again, I was trained as an anthropologist, and my interest was religion and spirituality. I went with fascinating research trip, follow spirit medium to the battlefield where they got possessed by soldier, and so-called the soldier will tell them in their spiritual language where their body is. And so that constitutes the first draw of my research, in which I look at what I call spiritual forensics, how people employ various forms of cultural repertoire to help them and to aid them in that search for the body and the name and of the missing war dead in Vietnam. And of course, that is fascinating for an anthropologist, I can guarantee you. But at the same time, it's also very serious and important in a recognition that it is what I used to call desperate measure for desperate time call for desperate measure. Imagine 500,000 soldiers went missing in a war stretched out in 20 years, and let alone there are many other time frame that is not, you cannot put on the line like this, in a terrain that is South Vietnam. What in Vietnam people always say, where did your father die? Well, he died in the Southern Front. Southern Front come from the 17th parallel all the way down to the end of Vietnam, including part of Laos and Cambodia territory. So I don't know how big that terrain is, like whole state of Michigan you can think of, or several times the country of Holland. And that is the only answer they have in the Southern Front. So imagine that kind of scope and space and how impossible that task is. And only so much the spirit can tell you, although they claim they can tell you a lot. In 2013, the Vietnamese state have to resort to real science, in which they decide that in the end we have to use up-to-date scientific method to find an accounting for our war debt, and that is where the work of DNA forensics begin in Vietnam. And later, my colleague Andreas will tell you more about that. Now, the second question that asked, and how many minutes I have left? Okay, now that says that I have to, well, in my reflection, what are the topics that is still are out there missing in literature that we should pay attention to? And I can tell you, in my view, there's so many things that is missed out in that massive amount of literature on Vietnam War. And I see many young student face here, and I really hope that you will like my country. Come travel there, and you will like it. And I tell you, there are so many interesting topics that you can study, you can research. In my view, for instance, missing out in the literature on Vietnam War is, when we talk about Vietnam War, the people only think only about Vietnam, whereas Laos and Cambodia are missing. From my Hmong story, they have to pulling me for several years until I realized that they are part of my story. And similarly, today, in the whole effort of recovering Vietnam War debt, the effort went silent when it comes to Cambodia, when it comes to Laos. The other topic, but because of the interest of time, I would like to share with you two short stories that constitute, that will tell you the line of research that I would really want to spend time in the years to come to study. So quickly, in 2022, finally I can come back to Vietnam after the pandemic. I met a lady, and she used to be a young young militia. She is a volunteer form. You participate in war, and by the way, more than several 100,000, maybe 500,000 Vietnamese women went to join that kind of war effort. But this lady, she told me that she had spent her entire life waiting for her fiancé. He is a soldier who went to war and never come back. In 2022, after the opening up of State Archive, after also initial pilot testing of DNA, their family found a grave. That is possibly his grave, and the remain inside that possibly his. The lady went to that cemetery 1,500 kilometers from her home. She brought with her a set of pillowcase. She embroidered in that pillowcase a pair of loving doves carrying little roses. Also, she brought with her a little baby dress. These are items that she embroidered and prepared in her years working in the jungle as a war volunteer, waiting for her fiancé, because these are what she prepared for their wedding night, for their life together when the war ends. He never come back. In 2022, after facing the death of the pandemic, she survived. She came to the cemetery with this item, and this is what she said to him. I have brought this keepsake here with you. I have kept them for 50 years, but now I'm tired, and I want you to keep it for me until I join you at the other side. And in Vietnam, we burn items for the dead. So we burn effigy, we burn paper. In this case, she burned the treasure that she kept with her for 50 years. This lady, her story, has really touched me. I used to cry when I write. I'm now writing her case up, and with her permission, I hope to draw attention to the aspect of war that is missing out in literature, namely the dimension, the gender dimension of war, in which women are making so much sacrifice and are also carrying the largest burden of accounting for the war debt, and yet their voice is silent, and they can only say that in this kind of very intimate setting, but there is more attention that needs to be drawn to them. In the second case, I don't have a lot of time, but Dad and I, in our future research, want to pay attention to the what we call the slow violence, the long legacy of Vietnam War, in which death is counted in an indefinite number. And I was brought to this case by a amazing encounter. And as an anthropologist, you met so many people, but this is one case that I will never forget. I met the face of victory of Vietnam in 2023. I traveled also 1,500 kilometers to the northern part of Vietnam, where I met a man who is very famous in Vietnam because he was the face of a photograph the Vietnamese government used as a propaganda to show that we win the America. His face is called the Smile of Victory of Quang Tri Citadel. I went there, I met him, and the man I met is a man broken by grief and by pain, not by the radiance of victory, because it turned out that 50 years later, although he survived, he come back with full arm and legs and no wounds visible to be seen, but his son was born very weak, and the grandson was born with a sort of brain defect that when I came to visit the man, he just lost the only grandson. In Vietnam, it's very important that your name is carried on through bloodline, through a grandson, and he's the only male heir that he has died. And the soldier believed that it was Asian, it was dioxin exposure that he suffered during the Vietnam War. It is Agent Orange that killed him and killed his future. So these are among many things that are missing, but let us not be despair and remain our hope, and especially the intervention of science that will probably be one of the angles that provide us hope. So Andreas, please tell us more about the work ICMP is doing with Vietnam, for Vietnam.
Okay, thank you. So take it back. No, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity, and great pleasure to be here. So I'm speaking for the International Commission on Missing Persons, which is an intergovernmental organization based in The Hague. It has been around for quite a long time. It was first created for the wars in the former Yugoslavia by the Clinton administration, and then after 20 years of successful work, primarily addressing 45,000 persons who were missing after the wars in the former Yugoslavia, but subsequently also events around the world. So I was personally in Phuket after the tsunami. So a lot of international work took place eventually, and that's when the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Wim Kok, took the lead in bringing ICMP to The Hague as an international organization. So the Netherlands was always very prominently involved with ICMP. So it was a natural location to come to. The second consideration is that, and this is somewhat relevant to what I have to say, the second consideration was that ICMP was not created as a humanitarian outfit, but as a human rights and rule of law organization. That means it is not supposed to work on the sidelines independently of judicial and other government institutions, but it should secure the cooperation of governments and help them to meet their obligations. And in the context of missing persons, they have obligations towards the families of the missing, which have been recognized in human rights courts. So families have a right to an effective investigation. That is a universal principle under the rule of law, and therefore you will find ICMP today in very diverse and different scenarios. But on the outset, always asking the same question, how many missing are there? Who are the missing? Where are they missing? Why are they missing? Why do they remain missing? Why is nothing being done? And if something is being done, why doesn't it work? So along these lines, we then try to make proposals and try to advance processes to have a more equitable response to missing persons. Now, ICMP coming in contact with Vietnam, notably under a project financed by USAID. It was briefly interrupted and then reinstated, so we were able to continue. The first thoughts and first considerations had to be given is that the missing persons in Vietnam, we have the Vietnam War, what we're commemorating right now, which was marked by asymmetrical warfare, which already told us that we had a situation where the North was under-resourced during the war. The Americans, of course, were using advanced weapons, massive aerial bombings, chemical warfare, causing incredible damage. That's the North in particular suffered. But the North engaging in guerrilla warfare also meant very close combat situations, and the North also as a policy had accepted that we are going to take heavy losses to get the Americans to abandon their adventure. So ultimately, that, of course, turned out in the United States losing that war. But the death toll is there, the missing persons are there, predominantly in the North. The North also having won the war, now posed particular challenges. Historically, the investigative efforts regarding missing persons have been more thorough in the North than in the South. That's understandable. It's like this in many countries in such situations. And the project that ICMP engaged in now is a cooperation with VAST, which is the Vietnamese Academy of Science and Technology, and the ICMP, in particular the ICMP's Science and Technology Department, to set out to develop means how more instruments can be put at the disposal of the government to more equitably address the missing persons situation across the country, which, however, encounters a couple of difficulties I want to address. We have already heard why it is so terribly important to address the issue of missing persons in the cultural and religious beliefs in Vietnam that have to do a lot with belief, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not the expert, I'm a lawyer, with cultural beliefs that inculcate also ancestors and the need to recover remains and to properly bury them, to provide them with happiness so they will not be an ailment to their relatives. Now, we see this also in other countries where spirits haunt families. Families are being marginalized. That is a problem for an entire society. So also at that particular spiritual level, it's very important to be able to bring missing persons home so as to reduce one rift that separates one part of the society from another. So I just mentioned that the USAID program was suspended. It was then reinstated. Late in 2023, the US ambassador to Vietnam, Mark Knapp, reaffirmed that it would be continued. So also on the part of the United States is a great understanding and recognition of the importance of that particular endeavor for the healing of society. So, of course, we're very, very glad about this development and that we can continue our work on this. Now, this scientific cooperation, which had been going on for almost 1.5 years, has been successful. Now, the difficulty that had to be addressed from a scientific perspective is that the remains of the victims had been in the jungle, more or less, for 50 years. The conditions are not very good for the preservation of human remains. They're also not very good for the preservation of DNA, which is what the scientific method is that we're talking about. So DNA does not preserve very well under such conditions. But that's only one aspect. The other aspect is you need to have reference family donors with whom you can compare the DNA you take from a missing person. This is not one-to-one matching, this is kinship matching. These are complicated algorithms that allow you to take a grandson or a mother and some other relatives and some exclusion family members, and you have a calculation that can give you a very high probability of the identity of the remains of a missing person. The difficulty here is not only the decomposition of the remains, there not being much DNA left, but also now you have to compare that little DNA to the third and fourth generation. So first of all, you have to find these people. You have to find out with some reliability who is actually a relative of this person, and it's a very difficult calculation getting there. You need a lot more information from minute amounts of DNA. So the research project was to see whether that can be done. So far, ICMP's the workhorse in our laboratories is nuclear testing, STR DNA testing, which only goes that far. There has been attempts to at early stages, ICMP participated in something that's called next-generation sequencing or massive parallel sequencing, which looks basically at much more points on the chromosome for DNA information. So instead of under nuclear testing, you work with 24 loci, which is already more than the standard American test, but it's not that much. But these new methods that are being employed, they look at tens of thousands. So it's a very, very powerful method. Nobody was sure that it could be applied, whether there was even enough DNA left to utilize that approach. Now it was successful. So this can be rolled out. Vietnam now has an instrument at their fingertips, which can be rolled out across the entire country, building up databases. That will be the next major challenge, having large databases that can accommodate hundreds of thousands in this case, even more reference profiles, hundreds of thousands of post-mortem DNA profiles, and matching processes, and very importantly, a DNA test or a DNA test result in the end gives you a DNA match report. Basically says that sample is more likely to correspond to that sample as opposed to being unrelated to the general population. It does not tell you whose bones these are. So there will be an anthropological effort that will be quite significant to relate these results back to remains that are being exhumed. So there's a long road ahead, but a very important threshold has been taken. And I don't know how much time I have left. 2 minutes. Yeah, okay, so that result, that outcome, I mean, first of all, for Vietnam to establish such a cooperation with American funding, with an international organization in The Hague, is already quite a sign of commitment. That's opening up to international cooperation on a very sensitive subject. Having then succeeded with these results and having been reinstated by the administration, being allowed to continue, also gives high visibility to this. And that's the last point I would like to make. The success of this project is not confined to Vietnam now. Vietnam is now demonstrating something to the entire world, and not only in terms of technical capabilities in human identification work, but something very significant now for other theaters in the world, and that is accountability. Because now we know that we will be able to preserve evidence that can be used for accountability purposes, for instance in Syria or Russia and elsewhere, for 70 years. That is very important for families who've suffered these losses, because even when it takes a long time to find missing persons, and many family members will not find them anymore because they're too old. But they will know one thing. If I put my DNA reference sample on a database, this will be relevant for 70 years. And in 70 years, you find people. So it's an incredible development that came out of this cooperation. It's quite a leap, and we can see this already today in Syria. I mean, the Syrian families know about these increasing possibilities, and this will continue for other programs. We will probably see this for, the residential school problems that we have in the West everywhere that are a long time ago. We'll find application there. So I just want to finish on this note because it's a bit upbeat, and it can provide hope for many people. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Tom and Andreas, for this sort of important reflections on the post-war recovery efforts. And I think sort of your presentation, of course, touches upon a lot of important cultural dimensions in that play into the aftermath of the war, how society deal with the legacy, but also you brought up the whole aspects about sort of scientific expertise, but also international scientific collaborations, and how that's sort of very central to this to all of these efforts of dealing with the aftermath of war. And I am also very much struck again and again, since I also been in the Netherlands not so long ago. It's only been 5 years or so, but it's funny how the Netherlands always popped up in so many different, sort of, and things about Vietnam, in unexpected way. Political institution protests, but also scientific collaborations and all that sort of thing. So that's something to explore a little bit more in the future. I'm looking at the time at the moment, and so I think I'm quite tempted to open up the floor for discussions from the audience. And I see that we would get some help with the mic situation. So I would like to open up the floor, and if you have any questions to any of the speakers, please feel free to raise your hand.
Can I follow up? Can I follow up the last few stories about missing people?
Yeah.
First of all, do you make a difference between Mias, Bo Doi, and Ling during the Vietnam War, South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese? After the fall of Saigon, a lot of people disappeared as well in the countryside in South Vietnam. Are they also included in your research, which sounds very interesting to follow up? And to give an example, during Tet 68, 2,000 Hawaiians, scholars, writers, painters, are killed by the Viet Cong. We know that. They go my list. Rimco has written and referred to Nyaka's book. She was the poet who gave up Is that also included in your research? And then a last question for her, for Stephanie. Do you remember what kind of topic Hung Seng wrote in Hanoi when he got a PhD of history? Because he got his PhD from my good friend and the late Professor Van Oulé, and Van Oulé never told me in what language he wrote it and what the topic was. And what is important in it is not a silly question, because in the West we learned that Q Sampon wrote a thesis on something compared to Hitler's Mein Kampf. I went in '78 to Paris to get that thesis at the Bibliothèque de Sainte-Geneviève. And what happened, the thesis was in French written, and it was a very, let's say, very kind analysis about the independence of Cambodia from the rest of the world. There was nothing in it that could, let's say, propel already what happened as a blueprint for the future. So this kind of small questions, as an anthropologist and as an historian, are very important in your research, I think. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm John Klein. Retired from the University of Amsterdam and one of the first Vietnam scholars at my department.
Shall we collect one more question?
It's kind of comment about the war. There's a lady who made comments on Laos, said something, and the lady about Cambodia. As far as I remember, I used to be a student. I was born during the Second World War. I used to be a student during the Vietnam War and active participant in the anti-war movement. Late a year after, in the 1970, I lived a year in Laos. So I'm very surprised to meet a lady belonging to one of the hill tribes, as we call them there, the Mao called in Laos. Hmong must be one of your people. But what became clear to me in Laos was the fact that it was mainly due to the movements of the North Vietnamese going south to fight the South, and they created the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it was called, to protect their people through Laos, and later on Cambodia was involved by the North Vietnamese, actually. I think it was them who made Laos and Cambodia involved in the war, because Americans then started reacting on these Ho Chi Minh people on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and what happened in Cambodia. Would you agree to that?
Yeah. Okay. Shall we respond in order? Shall we start with John's questions towards the?
Thank you, John. John is my first professor in Vietnamese study. I met him in Vietnam in 2001 when you were teaching for Ford Foundation there, introducing us to idea of social science from the West. Thank you, John, for pointing out a very important question, what kind of bone we are looking at. From my own research project, let's decouple my work and Andreas here. At the NIOD, we are doing a project on bone of contentions. It is a metaphor for all the trouble that is left in Vietnam War, but literally it's also the bones that are contentious that we want to pay attention to them. We want to pay attention not only to the 500,000 Vietnamese soldiers who by their own right need to be found, identified. But we also want to call out for attention, and that is, for instance, one of the work project we have is that today as a host, he didn't have chance to introduce his own fascinating research in which he looked at how South Vietnamese population who are excluded from the state project on identifying their own lost, their own dead, have to resource through many other ways to do the work of healing themselves. And that look at how cemetery of South Vietnam is being cared for in a secret way by civil society, but also mounting up in the future. We hope that we can continue looking at ground up movement to safeguard information for the future identification. I'm interested, for instance, also in looking at how Vietnamese diaspora, I have looked at different groups that try to synchronize, to assemble information of their own lost in the re-education camp. So what happened after the unification of Vietnam? Many members of South Vietnam society and government were sent to camp and they never come back. We also want to look at the what I call vernacular accounting, the society effort to give a place to people who die at sea, who leave Vietnam in search of safety and freedom. And eventually our argument, because the second part of the project, Bone of Contention, is looking at the politics of reconciliation. And my argument is that the country might be unified, might be happy at the future, in the future as a unified country, but there is still one issue that is not solved, and the seed of contention remain, namely the reconciliation between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, between the two sides of the Vietnamese who were fighting this at this battle. And the Bone may be the first place that we think the work of reconciliation can be done. Sometimes it's very contentious because it either brings people together, like matching, or it actually divides the society further. But then again, we know that Bone have no ideological character. It only have material. It depends on what kind of sequence you get out of them. And we only can hope for a future that in which the matching is made. Very quickly answer to your question about Laos. That's what I argue. We should bring back Laos in. We have to pay attention to their story. Like my Hmong people tell me. In fact, my research in Minnesota are all about family who were associated with Vang Pao general. These are an army set up to help rescue American soldiers, and that's why they are caught into the Vietnam War, and their dislocation is also resulting from the bombing of Ho Chi Minh Trail. I think the story is much bigger, and it also a kind of continuity of the tragic fate of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. We are called Indochina, and often the West that come to us see us as one, and they, and then the machine of war that will draw all of them in. And in the future, as a scholar looking at the history and remembering, recognizing that war, we have to put Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam on the same page when it comes to remember that period. Thank you. Andreas, you want to talk quickly about whether the bones ICMP does also?
On the aspect of reconciliation through these processes?
Yeah, is there any different management in terms of...
No, of course not. So as I mentioned earlier, it's still early days. There have to be communication, reporting channels, databases. There has to be the possibility for anybody to report missing persons regardless of their nationality. Now, that's one aspect. The other important aspect, we always speak about soldiers, and by implication, therefore, the missing are predominantly male. And those who are looking up and asking about them are predominantly female. So there is a gender dimension to all of this that has its own difficulties, but more importantly, it has its own advantages. Because from what we've seen in other theaters, if women with missing persons or heads of families, female with missing persons, organize themselves, that is very, very effective. So I would hope this to happen, because if such organizations in the north and such organizations in the south, we've seen everywhere, they can talk to each other. They're much less likely to prolong inter-ethnic and other divides than we will see from people who look out for their electorates who are predominantly male. So that is something, at least from our experience, also what ICMP actively engages, is to give funding to such groups, fund their joint projects, get them to talk together to the government jointly, put them in one room. I mean, sometimes you end up with a yelling match, and that's fine too. But that's when you then get momentum, because they will build up a force in society that can actually weld and heal. So, but again, it's early days, but these are the things that we hope to emerge. So once databases are there, once campaigns are out, once the government explains what it is doing and what its new instruments mean, this will probably have traction.
Stephanie, you want to answer the questions about the thesis?
Yeah, sure. So to react to John, who, by the way, was also my PhD supervisor, I must mention it, I think it's very interesting what you say about the thesis of Khieu Samphan, because that's typically the problem, I mean, everything is seen from the point of view of the 17th of April, 75. So every document written before that is seen through this kind of Khmer Rouge prism. So we look backward. We never try to reconstruct history as it has been going, I mean, of course, when Khieu Samphan wrote his thesis in what was it, in the late 50s, maybe, in Paris, I mean, of course, he was not a Khmer Rouge. So that's the absurdity of the way we are doing history of Cambodia through this systematic democratic Kampuchea filter. As for Hun Sen's PhD, I wish I knew, because I have to say that historiography à la Hun Sen right now, it's something flabbergasting. I don't know how many of you have been to Cambodia lately or ever, but you have this gigantic monument on the outskirts of Phnom Penh, which is called the Win Win Monument, which is a gigantic, let's call it obelisk to stay there in some kind of neutral term, and with a bas-relief which is over 100 meters long, of all kinds of sculptures showing the glorious life of Hun Sen, liberating Cambodia. It's extremely intriguing. It's extremely organic, because every new success of Hun Sen is immediately engraved on a new spot on this monument memorial. But anyhow, what I noticed is that on the 17th of April this year, you would kind of have expected that maybe the Cambodians would say something about the 50 years of the fall of Phnom Penh. No, not at all. Nothing happened in Cambodia. The only thing that happened, and I think it's quite symbolic, was the visit of Xi Jinping. When you think about the Khmer Rouge, this super Maoist group, and what happens on the 17th of April is the visit of the Chinese president. You really have, some kind of surprise at that. But what Cambodia has marked was the 50 years of the 55 years of the deposition of Sihanouk, so the 18 March 70, because it is considered in Hun Sen or in official historiography as the beginning of the tragedy of Cambodia. Because if the Khmer Republic had not existed, if Sihanouk had stayed as a king of Cambodia, as the ruler of Cambodia, nothing would have happened. And what you see, it's a kind of whitewashing of the responsibility of Sihanouk, which certainly has a huge role in all what happened. And so I think politically it has an enormous meaning when you see that kind of historiography and that kind of positioning of Sihanouk. And it's actually connected to the question you were asking about Cambodia and the North Vietnamese and their responsibility. I mean, in part, Sihanouk created the situation because he allowed them to establish sanctuaries on Cambodian territory. On using Kampong Som, Sihanoukville, right now in the south as a port to bring, China from weapons from China. So he gave them that possibility, which they used. I mean, fair enough. And then, of course, the Americans reacted. And then Sihanouk was all the time, in between the two. And it's only around 69 that he finally decided, or 68, that he finally decided that, no, he would not support these Khmer communists. He would start repressing them. But, it was way too late. And he had really taken the country, into a war situation. War was in the making. It was just a matter of when exactly it would start.
It was the Americans with, in my view, because it was Kissinger who decided to bomb Cambodia. That really made the final explosion, let's say.
Absolutely, in 69.
I remember the thing going.
And then the incursion, the American incursion in April, June 70, which was also it had catastrophic consequences. It drove the Vietnamese communists westwards. And then, of course, they kept bombing until the 15th of August, 73. So, yeah.
We have one question in the back.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. That was really interesting, first of all. I traveled to Cambodia as a tourist maybe like 5 years ago. And among seeing many interesting places and things, we also went to Phnom Penh, and we saw the killing fields and S-21, the security prison. I think it was S-21. And I don't know how often schools and things go there to visit, and how well woven into education it is. But I was wondering, how does Vietnam, because I've never been to Vietnam, how does Vietnam remember the Second Indochina War, specifically in respect to museums or national holidays? How is that done there?
Did you mean the Third Indochina War, like its war with Cambodia? How does it remember Cambodia?
No, I mean the second one, the Vietnam War.
Well, there's one official narrative. The official political ideology of the Vietnamese Communist Party is Ho Chi Minh thought, Ho Chi Minh. And the official narrative is that it was not a civil war. It was a war between the Vietnamese people against foreign aggressors, and that the South was a puppet government. And it's always interesting for me to hear that it wasn't claims that it was not a civil war, because it's a fact that Vietnamese people were fighting each other. I guess one way to defend that claim is if you don't consider the South Vietnamese to be Vietnamese. They forfeited their Vietnameseness. So, but we could also see it as an international war. There were two sovereign countries, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and the Republic of Vietnam in the south. And Nguyen Van Thu, one of the last presidents of South Vietnam, would say, we wanted to just be left alone. And so, anyway, so the museums, the war museums, the name of the war museum, the War Remnants Museum, changed throughout time. It was much more intense, like the Museum of American War Crimes, and then it changed a few times, and now it's just the War Remnants Museum. What's fascinating is that War Remnants Museum recently opened an exhibit on Ngo Dinh Diem and the Republic of Vietnam recently with the consultancy of Edward Miller, who's one of the leading scholars. And so we are seeing a change, actually. I went to a spy museum in Saigon, which was about the Vietnamese communist spies. And the first thing they had us do when our group arrived, a group of Americans, is they made us kowtow to a statue of Ho Chi Minh. And they were taking pictures, like, don't take a picture of me doing this. But I went there again a year later, and they didn't have us do that. And so a few years ago, books were censored, certain books about free speech, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, but now I'm seeing it being sold. So I think we're seeing a change and different interests. University students at Fulbright University, Vietnam, are now doing research on South Vietnam. They're curious about it. I had them meet my parents in California, these kids from the other side, and so I think it's changing, but we're also seeing nationalists, so it's a struggle.
Very you know, earlier this month or the end of April and beginning of May, we had the grandest celebration of the end of the 50-year anniversary of the Vietnam War. And so if you look at the official narrative, it's what Karin just mentioned. It's still one story have to be told, and it have to be straight that way. But if you look at the society at large, we have a very dynamic society of more than 100 million people with growing young people who are engaged with the world and engaged with their own history. And in that kind of space, you see many dynamic and interesting democracy of memories in which people turn memorial into a place that they commemorate the life and the story that are not officially in the national narrative. But you also have Vietnam is very spiritual society. So my kind of lady, they go and do praying for own side, own soul and own spirit are included in this kind of commemoration. It probably slightly different than Cambodia, where I can imagine, sorry for my limited knowledge of Cambodia, I want to learn more, but I think in Cambodian post-war museum and narrative are very much structured around the question of, you know, truth and reconciliation and education in the killing field, in the prison and so on is still part of educating the population about the atrocity. And Vietnam has maybe the luxury of moving a little bit further than that. There is still part of that education, but there is also space for people to commemorate the war in their own way.
And by the way, that's interesting because you mentioned S21, which is the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, but My Lam, who was the curator who was in charge for the War Remnants Museum, was the one who was sent to Cambodia in 1979 to conceive not only the museum, the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, but also what to do with the archive, because there was a trial of Pol Pot and Ieng Sary in absentia in August 1979. And it's very interesting because you see again this kind of effect of Cambodia being, you know, the sideshow of Vietnam. For a very, very long time, it was thought that Tuol Sleng was a kind of Vietnamese museum as well, which cast some kind of doubt about, you know, the reality of what had happened. But that was from the Khmer Rouge, who were not called the Khmer Rouge anymore, but the Party of Democratic Kampuchea. They were far away in the jungle, supported by China and the United States until 1991. So that was, you know, the kind of argument they used. But in fact, recent research about S21, Tuol Sleng, the evolution of Tuol Sleng as a museum, has shown that the Cambodians had much more agency in the construction of the museum than what was thought before. So here again, you have a kind of emancipation of Cambodia from this kind of shadow of Vietnam, but still with a lot of connections between.
I think we can take one more question. Oh, there's two. Okay, I can do two. Yeah, I can put them all together.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. I had three questions, not too big, but first I want to ask Remco about how was the Dutch opinion on the Vietnam War in the aftermath, and especially like the refugees that came here, like because you mentioned about like the leftist groups and stuff. How was like the mass media, like the general population?
I get you.
Yeah, you can.
Now, very short answer. This is one topic that really should be investigated. There are a few students who did, but looking at, for example, cities like Amsterdam or smaller cities like Hoorn, how did they shelter these people, and what were, especially the opinions of the Vietnamese, of the Dutch, interest me. So this is a topic that we all should look at. So I cannot say more than that. Maybe John can, because John has made a book about it, and he's going to show it now. It's oral history.
Just published a book written by Lamont, Verdreven naar de Zee in Dutch. 18 boat people have written their stories, and I had the humble task to write an introduction on it. there you can see what happened exactly town by town.
Yes.
These boat people have been received and treated by the Dutch.
Yes, but this is oral history, and as an historian, I really like to see documents. Too. Okay. Yeah.
Oral history. Okay. And then one more question over here, I think. Oh,
We still have two more questions.
oh.
I don't know about time, so
Yeah, we're a bit short on time, so I think we can also go. But I think she has one question, so let's go.
Hi, thank you. This is sort of a follow-up question about the memory or the official narrative and how the importance of that is changing. And so how much does this matter to sort of like the current ruling parties' like legitimacy? Is that part of what's changing? And also, is the importance of the relationship with the United States, could that also be like a cause or an effect? So just sort of like the changing importance of the official narrative and what might be driving that, if you could speculate on that. Thank you.
Can I be real quick?
Yeah.
So the Vietnamese government, they like to say that they practice what's called bamboo diplomacy, where you want to maintain a relationship even though if you bend it, and so they're very pragmatic. Now, the Communist Party, they have what you might call performance-based legitimacy. I mean, they did a good job, but compared to other post-colonial nations, I mean, in terms of life expectancy, education, sharing the benefits of economic growth with its population, they're doing a pretty good job. And so the main thing is for them to stay in power. And so they have been quite, in terms of cracking down on protesters and free speech, they are actually quite responsive sometimes to protests and things like that. But the narrative is the glue that holds everything together, I think. And so it's important to have a foundational myth. Any nation needs a good myth. And so that is really strong in Vietnam. And so it's a very useful myth. One thing I feel it's my duty to say that I didn't say earlier is about Cambodia. How do the Vietnamese remember their occupation of Cambodia for 10 years? Now, I met with the father of someone here who was a soldier and general in Cambodia, Vietnamese general in Cambodia, and he was telling us that it's really taboo in Vietnam. It's a shameful topic because there is a lot of guilt. Some Vietnamese soldiers say, we feel like the Americans occupying Vietnam like we are occupying Cambodia. So many people were killed. No one wants to talk about it. It's so shameful. They also don't want to talk about their colonization, their history of colonialism. I have a friend who's a professor of Vietnamese colonialism of the Champa. I mean, the authorities are like not pleased.
If I may quickly add to that, the name we have in Vietnam for our intervention in Cambodia is nhiệm vụ quốc tế, so international duty. And that is one narrative that Vietnam have, namely that genocide happened in Cambodia, the rest of the world blind their eyes and put a plug in their ear. No one wants to do anything. We did it. So we wipe out the Khmer Rouge. We also die massively. And by the way, I'm trying to find out why now at this moment in the last 2 years there's intensification of exhumation of Vietnamese soldiers in Cambodia. And among 217,000, more or less, so let's say 200,000 missing body from the Vietnam War. The majority come from the Chiến dịch Tây Nam, the southwest campaign, which is encompassing mostly the fighting in Cambodia. So Vietnam has managed to find quite a lot of body back from Laos and also exhume them in different terrain in Vietnam, and also, but the majority of the missing in body is either in Cambodia or in mass grave in southern Vietnam. So that we are waiting to see what the story from the grave will tell us and will unfold. But definitely the part of Vietnam War relating to the Cambodian side is one of the most sensitive and debated and complex topic in the already complicated enough story of Vietnam War.
Okay, I think I'm looking at the time. I'm looking at the spouse and 25 people, and also the wine and the drinks. But so I think we should wrap up. I just want to sort of ask everyone to join me to give a round of applause to all the distinguished speakers today for helping us to understand this very complex history. And it was a pleasure to have all of you on board. Oh yes, of course. Please stay for drinks and mingles.
Thank you. I started reading this new book. Yeah. No, we talk. Yeah. Well, we were thinking of doing like two books together. I mean, both of our books on